because this is a state of the state, had nothing to do with Indiana. All the governor did tonight was throw out cutlets of dripping red meat for Iowa Republican caucus voters. We heard a lot of platitudes. We heard a lot of going down the Tea Party checklist for those who may have a role in choosing the next president, but we didn't hear very much about Indiana. We didn't hear a single word about our salaries and wages that are in the gutter here for working people here in Indiana. We didn't hear an acknowledgement that even his own party has grave reservations about the direction of educational changes here in Indiana. We made a very simple proposal. If he wants to increase funding for education, let us see it. Show us. Put different pots of money on the table and let it be clearly demonstrated who we're helping, who we're cutting, and what changes we're making. That's extraordinarily important. We saw nothing directed towards the middle class or even a suggestion of anything directed towards the middle class. We heard about this idea for a balanced budget amendment. Look, every person in here is for a balanced budget. We've all voted for balanced budgets. We support them. We even already have a requirement in Indiana's Constitution that we incur no debt for operating expenses. Yet I guess we heard something today that's going to sound good for voters outside of Indiana. Perhaps he doesn't trust his two supermajorities to deliver a balanced budget. But I tell you what, he could be playing with something of which he has no idea. Maybe he's proposing something that might force tax increases at the state and local level down the road. Perhaps he'll be forcing ideas from which he'll be long gone and long departed by the time we feel the consequences here. Is that. And then finally, we didn't hear about what people are saying out on the streets and sidewalks of this state. They're worried about college expenses. Nothing. They're not worried about healthcare rhetoric. They're worried about whether they can pay their doctor bills. They're worried about whether their children are going to go to a safe school. They're think tank experiments. I'm sorry, but I think this speech fell woefully short. It wasn't about the people of Indiana. It was about grander ambitions, and for that, I think it was a gravely missed opportunity. Senator Lanane.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. I would have to agree that I'm a little worried that this speech had its eye a little bit more on the year 2016 and not so much on the year 2015 and what are the real problems that your average Indiana citizen is facing. I've been around here for a while. My first State of the State speech was back in 1998. You sort of remember some of the more memorable ones, or at least the ones that catch your attention. And I remember in 2005 when Governor Daniels said, I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect that the biggest problem that the state of Indiana had at that time, 10 years ago, was the low per capita income of the people of the state of Indiana. And here we are 10 years later. I didn't hear anything in that speech to really address how are we going to raise the real incomes of real people in the state of Indiana. Because, Leader, you're right. There are people out there, average Hoosier is just struggling to make ends. And they're worried about how they're going to pay those health care bills and pay the rent, and pay the mortgage, put food on the table and clothes on the backs of their kids. And while the governor's speech contained many fine phrases, I have to say I did not hear any real solutions to those problems. The two biggest problems we have still in the state of Indiana is that wages are stagnant. You can talk about all the jobs you've created. I'm glad we've created those jobs, but the fact of the matter is that those are veritably low-wage type of jobs that have been created. At least 10 years ago, our health care standing in the state of Indiana, we were better than we are now. That's the sad fact of the matter, is that we actually are worse off now today than we were back when I first started in the Indiana General Assembly in terms of the overall state of health of the people of Indiana. And so while the governor wants to talk about fighting Obamacare, I say to him, let's at least get some health care for the people of the state of Indiana. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and he's been putting off and putting off and putting off, but it doesn't help that person who's out there without health care in the state of Indiana. What this speech should have really been about was real solutions for the real problems of the people of the state of Indiana. And, as far as this balanced budget amendment, we've been balancing budgets ever since I've been here. Since 1998, I can't think of one time we didn't pass a balanced budget in the state of Indiana. That's not a problem that we have here in the state of Indiana, so I don't know if he's doubting the ability of the leadership in the Indiana General Assembly with their supermajorities to pass balanced budgets in the state of Indiana. I can assure him, and I know you will too, Leader, we'll help get those balanced budgets. We don't have any problems in that regards. So it seemed to me that that particular proposal was more about politics than it was policy. That's what I'll say about that budget. The devil's always in the detail. We'll take a look at it and what it means not only for the state of Indiana, but for local units of government, as you said, Mr. Leader. So, I just think that there's so much more that could have been done. This idea of increasing funding for education, all for that, of course, but it's what do you do with those dollars? He says $200 million in terms of an increase in education, but I've seen some details in terms of where at least a good portion of that money would go, and it would go for some things that I think we need to really step back and take a look at, namely expanding the voucher program in the state of Indiana, which drains money actually from public education, and putting more money into our charter school systems, which really we don't even know the scores out on charter schools and how well they're doing. So you take all of that out of the mix, and then we'll see what the real dollars are that are going for public education. I applaud more money for public education. I am disappointed in two things this evening. Number one, we shouldn't just be talking about maintaining funding for preschool in the state of Indiana. This has been an issue which has been very close to our caucus, and we applaud the governor for mentioning it in his speech tonight. But what people want to really see is an expansion of early childhood education for the state of Indiana. I don't think we heard that tonight, Mr. Leader. The other thing which I think for the funding for the additional 77 child protective service workers that we need in the state of Indiana, so that the state of Indiana follows the law and complies with those mandates that we put into law 10 years ago now, that says here are what the standards for caseloads for protecting children in the state of Indiana. Now, a State of the State address, just like a budget, is about priorities. And I am a little disappointed that I didn't hear that as the number one priority for the people of the state of Indiana, because I can tell you, I know that that is their priority, protecting children. So with that, Mr. Leader, I'll turn it back to you for any final comments, or we can open
Be
it up
happy to
to
take questions.
So what did you expect the governor to say?
How well do you think this speech will play in Iowa?
Well, I tell you what, it's a garden variety Republican primary voter speech. He hit all the marks. A lot of three-word solutions in there. Balanced budget amendment. Doesn't matter if you already have one, you said it. School credits and vouchers. Double down on those. You check that mark. You fit in some platitudes about public safety. You talk about doing things the Hoosierific way and how we perfected things here in our state, and we can do the same thing for your state. He hit the cues. He hit the cues.
Yeah.
It just didn't have anything to do with the listeners and viewers at stations like yours.
Yeah, you hit the federal government. You disparage Obamacare, and
So what did you
You're
expect
there.
him to say tonight? I mean, honestly, seriously.
Well, that's it. Certainly, we've heard a lot of talk about education. So I was not surprised that he talked about education. You heard it in the Republican campaigns. They know that they messed up the distribution of our school dollars. They know there are problems everywhere. So the fact that he was conceding that we need to at least discuss these things and try to fix some of the mess we made, that's understandable. From an ideological perspective, I wasn't particularly surprised he wants to double down on the, because I know he has some pragmatic lawmakers in both chambers that are probably going to try to tell him no. So that's a freebie. But I think it's more telling for what wasn't in it. I mean, there's still people that are struggling out there. They're happy gas prices are down. That's the first good news they've had in a while. Didn't have anything to do with Mike Pence. They're happy that there's a national economic recovery and that the national economy is growing. Didn't have anything to do with Mike Pence, but they're also struggling in terms of their household income. That's not getting better. And the evidence is that we're one of the states that's an unwitting cause of that national problem. We're helping exacerbate it. So we need a more realistic picture of what's happening out there, because what we heard tonight was not tackling the everyday problems that people are encountering. What we heard is just a rhetoric that's aimed at a few, And that's fundamentally what was so disappointing.
You know, what I wished I had heard him say was, it's fine for him to talk about the accomplishments of his administration. One sort of expects that. But you also would hope they would say, here's realistically what our problems are. Our wages are too low. We are rated somewhere 38th, 40th, 41st in the worst in the nation when it comes to per capita income. And here's what I intend to do about it. Here's how we can increase the real wages of people. Here's how we can give them the work skills that they need to compete in this economy. Here's how we can learn really good jobs to the state of Indiana. Oh, and also, let's look at our health care for the people of the state of Indiana. By any measure, we are in the bottom 20% when it comes to the healthiness of our citizens. And find solutions to how we address that, whether it's educating our citizens on the things which are not good for how we actually get access to health care to people in the state of Indiana. We could look at solutions, as the leader has talked about, for those people that are at the bottom part of the economic rung. We've talked about increasing the minimum wage. Yes, we think that would bring people up. But for those people who are just struggling to make it from paycheck to paycheck, why not take a hard look at things like the earned income tax credit and increasing that? That's something our caucus has advocated. That does bring people out of poverty. So helping those individuals who are trying to get education, post-secondary education, with their indebtedness in that regards. All these are things that could have been addressed, I think, substantively, and we didn't hear one thing about those.
If the balanced budget proposal came to the floor, either the House or Senate, would you guys vote for that?
It depends on what it says. I mean, if it's a reaffirmation of our current policy and it's not going to force tax increases in the future or force tax hikes for local services, then you look at it, you take it as it comes. We're all for a balanced budget. None of us are for saddling our kids with debt. But what we have here is a rhetorical flourish. It's a solution in search of a problem. This isn't a problem here in Indiana. We know how to manage our books, and we have legal mechanisms to ensure that happens. Those are good things. The fact that he just added something in addition to that, well, it's nice to say, but it's not going to have any practical effect on the men and women and children of this state.
I have to admit it'd be pretty hard to vote against that, I suppose. But honestly, the question becomes, do you really need it? And what is the impact of it? We've passed some things in the past in regards to our Constitution to see it play out then in terms of real effects. And so you'd have to be very careful about exactly what are the ramifications of the language that you're proposing to put into your constitutional document.
There were a couple of big items on there, the balanced budget amendment, the EPA war on coal, where Democrats just didn't applaud at all.
Democrats applauded for the war on coal. At least 4, I can.
The vast majority didn't.
Tom, coal is not a partisan issue. We have lawmakers in our caucus that like coal, lawmakers that aren't as enthused about it. That has more to do with regional differences. And if there's members, I expected we did have some members applauding, and I'm certain that a few from southern Indiana were. You may just have.
Sure.
It's hard to see everyone all in one view.
And to me, again, that was more with an eye towards 2016 and the war on coal and the federal government and the EPA and all that type of stuff. But it sort of does depend on where you're from. I mean, my district, I'm not hearing a lot of complaints about a war on coal, to be honest with you.
When the governor announced his education agenda, he talked about reforming the SBOE in relation to the superintendent. There was no mention of that tonight. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's because Glenda Ritz was sitting there. I'd like to think he was maybe being polite.
Yeah, I guess I would hope even further. Hope that maybe somewhere he's going to rein in these people who want to take this whole issue on and sort of explode this session and division and just turn it into a political war.
Is pushing it out to 2021 to make her appointed, though, isn't that fair in terms of it's 2 more election cycles?
It'll just all be seen as an attack on the superintendent.
Again, he'll be long gone by then.
Seem happy about that.
Well, there's always somebody.
Anything in there Democrats as a caucus will be enthusiastic about?
Well, look, we like to have the debate about education. The fact that we're going to have an education session, I think, is something that gets all of our blood flowing. I mean, that's what a lot of us are here to work on. The chance to have economic debates, even if we're not necessarily engaged in the debate with the state of the state, that's something we're enthused about. We also appreciate, things like the honoring of our servicemen and women and our public safety officers. Those are all terrific things. But are there philosophical differences that have been highlighted? Yes, and certainly of his three I believe this is his third one. I would say there's probably the most stark differences, and it is obvious. He's possibly moving on to a national stage, and like Richard Nixon said, you got to run hard to the right in the primaries, and you got to run as hard as you can back to the middle if you're lucky enough to get the nomination. Right now, we're only seeing the run hard to the right part.
I'd answer, Eric, your question this way. I mean, I like the idea of $200 million additional for education, but I think he should let Scott and I decide exactly how those funds get, spent. So I think he's got the right idea in terms of an increase there. But and also, I'm glad that he mentioned the pre-K, at least in the speech. It shows to me that he is committed to that going forward. I think, obviously the difference I have is I think we should be doing it at a faster rate. I think that would be better for our state. And then finally, I agreed. It's been a good week for the Colts and for the state of Indiana.
We always like to finish on a happy note. And that
Thank
was
you,
certainly one
everybody.
to do. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.